As you leave the summit of Culp's Hill and proceed to your next stop, you will drive along portions of Cemetery Hill, named for the evergreen cemetery situated on its crown. The cemetery is easily discernible by the large brick archway that spans its entrance. The gatehouse to the cemetery became an icon of the battlefield, still visible today to your front right as you approach the Baltimore Pike. The gatehouse had a sign on it during the battle that specifically stated that firearms were strictly forbidden within the grounds. During the fighting on July 2nd, a Confederate artillery round struck the sign and knocked it to the ground, prompting Union General Oliver Howard to remark to a nearby colonel, "Colonel, the ordnance has been rescinded." Supposedly, it was one of the few times that Howard ever joked during the Civil War. I don't want to downplay, however, the heavy action on Cemetery Hill, because at the same time the Confederates attacked General Greene's men on top of Culp's Hill, they also launched attacks on Cemetery Hill. The difference between Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill is that the Confederates actually captured the crest of Cemetery Hill for a brief moment in the battle. At about 9:30 at night, Louisianans and North Carolinians physically got to the top of Cemetery Hill. Personal accounts from the soldiers recall how desperate the fighting was. At points, it was literally hand-to-hand combat. Union gun crews, being overrun by the Confederates, resorted to clubbing the enemy with their cannon implements in a frantic attempt to retain their guns. Eventually, Union reinforcements arrived in the darkness. Without any reinforcements of their own, the Confederates were forced to give up the ground they had briefly claimed. One of the Southern officers who took part in the attacks on Cemetery Hill that evening was a man by the name of Isaac Avery, Colonel Isaac Avery. And on July 2nd, 1863, Colonel Avery was acting in temporary command of a brigade of troops from his native North Carolina. As his men were attacking the hill that evening, a bullet struck him in the throat. Avery fell to the ground and quickly realized the finality of his wound. With his life ebbing away, he pulled out a sheet of paper and scribbled a final note to his subordinate, Major Samuel Tate of the 6th North Carolina Infantry Regiment. The note read, "Major, tell my father that I died with my face to the enemy." He handed the note to Tate and soon after expired. Today, that note, a real testimonial, I think, to the bravery of the men who fought at Cemetery Hill, is still preserved at the North Carolina Division of Archives and History. So as the fighting came to a halt on July 2nd, 1863, Colonel Avery would join the thousands of other brave soldiers who would make this the bloodiest of the three-day conflict. By the time the last musket was heard on the evening of July 2nd, nearly 20,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured from both sides. Lee had tested both ends of the Union line, and he could not move them. So as Day 3 approached, the Confederate chief decided he would attack his enemy where they were the weakest. Lee believed this was the middle. Lee's initial plan for July 3rd, 1863 called for a coordinated attack against the Federal line with two parts of Lee's army. Orders were given to General Ewell to renew his assault on Culp's Hill, while at the same time, 6,000 Virginians under the command of General George E. Pickett, Lee's last fresh division of soldiers, would charge the left center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. The goal was to drive a wedge in the Union position. Once divided, Lee's soldiers could attack and destroy each section of the Union line in turn. Battles are so easily won on paper. The reality of warfare, however, is that even the best plans are not so easily executed. Such was the case on July 3rd, 1863. At about 4:30 in the morning, Union cannons began pounding the Confederate positions at the base of Culp's Hill. The Union 12th Corps had made up their mind to retake the trenches the Confederates had won the night before. Thus started a bitter and exhausting 7-hour firefight. Pickett's Confederate troops were still marching to the field when the attack commenced at Culp's Hill. The Union Army had preempted Lee and thereby derailed his plan before it even got off the ground. By the time the sounds of battle began to fade, it was nearly 11 a.m. With Ewell driven from the trenches of Culp's Hill, Lee now looked for another option that once and for all would settle the question of the battle.